was a classic example of a man who was locked up for 8 years as a result of a rush to judgment.
Hello, and welcome to the 14th episode of Unsolved. My name is Samantha Kecker. I'm a student here at the University of Ottawa, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Kathleen and Fatima.
My name is Kathleen Ireton, and I am a criminology student at the University of Ottawa, currently applying for my master's with interest in studying false convictions in Canada.
Hi, I'm Fatima Fayaz, and I'm currently working with Innocence Ottawa at the University of Ottawa.
Today, as promised, we'll be discussing the Robert Baltovich case. Now, this is an important case to us, and I think to our viewers, because it happened so close to Ottawa. Okay, let's get started. Who is Rob, and what's his case all about? Rob was a student at the University of Toronto, Scarborough campus, and so was Elizabeth Bain. They first met in September 1987 and didn't start dating until a couple of years later. Elizabeth, known by her friends and family as Liz, disappeared on June 19, 1990. Liz and Rob had an interesting relationship, mostly normal. It was filled with love and lust, as well as some fighting. It's also important to let our viewers know that Liz had tried to commit suicide in the past and was cutting her wrists. She was often on edge and then really happy during her relationship with Rob, as she outlined in her diary entries. On the day of Liz's disappearance, Liz told Rob that after class she was going to hang out with a friend called Arlene Coventry. Rob told detectives that on the day of Liz's disappearance, in the morning, he spoke to Liz on the phone, where he told her of the errands he was running during the day and the wantingness to go to the gym in the evening. Around 6:30 in the evening, Rob left his home, said goodbye to his family members, and made his way to the recreational center. While driving along Kingston Road, he saw Liz's car parked in the valley near the tennis courts. He was confused because she had class that night at 7, and the windows were left open. Then he thought maybe she went for a run before class or wanted to walk up the hill to class. He got back in his car and drove to the tennis courts to see if maybe she was around there. When she wasn't, he returned to the car, having doubts about their relationship and believing maybe that Liz was out there meeting another guy. He wrote a note saying, "Don't leave your windows open and have a good night tonight." He then left, starting to drive towards campus. While driving, he thought leaving the note would be weird, so he returned to take it back. He left the car for the third time around 7:15. While he was leaving, he decided he would meet Liz at the end of her class to see what's going on. Liz never walked out of her classroom, so Rob decided to walk in and noticed that there was a back door, a second exit where Liz could have left, an easier exit for her to reach her car. Over the next few days, searches were done by the community. On June 22, 1990, 3 days after Liz's disappearance, her car was found. I think that here is an important part to let our viewers know that Rob, at the beginning of the investigation, turned over his DNA, some personal effects, clothing, and did a polygraph test. Rob failed the polygraph test, which he did against his lawyer's advice and without his lawyer's knowledge.
Yes, and although polygraph tests are deemed inadmissible within the court of law because Rob failed it, this only confirmed what the police detectives already thought, that Rob was in fact the killer.
Yes, and I think it's important to note here that Rob was fidgeting, turning around in his chair, checking out the equipment throughout his polygraph test, which made the police officers believe even more that he was nervous and that he was going to get caught in that instance. Anyways, some tangible and forensic evidence found by the investigators are bugs that were found on Liz's car that could be found near a body of water, plants that were inspected, most of whom were considered to be normal for the region, except for one leaf stained by blood. This leaf belonged to the dog strangling vibe, which could be found in Toronto, Kingston, Cobourg, and other places, one of which was where a witness swore to have seen Liz. There was blood, which was examined and compared to the blood of Liz's parents, confirmed to be a female DNA and a descendant of Rick and Julie Bain. Rob's shorts were also taken into examination that he was wearing the day of the disappearance and had traces of red smears, which turned out to not be blood.
Forensic science is not absolute. It's about interpretation of the individual viewing such evidence.
Yes, you're right, with the exception of blood. The rest of the forensic evidence is known as trace evidence and is sometimes the type of science that is understood to be fact when more often than not it is interpreted and represented in a way that fits a specific timeline developed by someone. In this case, the story told by the detectives on what happened to Elizabeth Bain. This is problematic because testimony relating to forensic evidence could present an inaccurate suggestion that the evidence is uniquely connected to the accused. After a press conference done by the Bain family on Elizabeth's birthday, pleading for her return, over 600 calls had come into the police station where many people had allegedly seen Liz on or after the day of her disappearance. One of the best witnesses that the police had found during their investigation was a childhood friend of Liz's who worked at the tennis courts and believed to have seen Liz with a man who had dark hair with two other women sitting at a picnic table near them the day of her disappearance. Her name is Marianne Pertz. When Marianne testifies to seeing Liz, she's not sure of the man she saw Liz with. A detective introduces the topic of hypnosis to enhance her recollection of the day Liz disappeared. Prior to her appointment with the doctor, Marianne had seen a couple of articles depicting Rob as the suspect in Liz's disappearance. This added to what was already being reiterated to her from the Bain family. After the hypnosis session, the detective brought a number of photos to Marianne to look at and see if she could see the man she saw on June 10th with Liz. Prior to showing the photos, he mentioned that Rob's picture was part of the photo array. This is one of the many problems with eyewitness testimony, which in turn increases the likelihood of miscarriages of justice. With regard to the specific interaction with the detective showed the witness a number of photos all at once. Even the witness stated that she picked through an elimination process. That being said, the officer reinforced the idea that the perpetrator was in the array and that the perpetrator was Rob. Additionally, the witness had previously been influenced by the media and by the Bain family. One of the other tennis instructors that worked the day of Elizabeth's disappearance says that they did not see anyone resembling Elizabeth or Rob at the tennis courts or near the picnic tables that day. The police officers quickly disregarded this statement, even though the tennis instructor knew both Rob and Liz very well. This further enforces the argument that police only focused on Rob as a suspect and in turn developed tunnel vision. On November 19, 1990, Robert Baltovich was arrested for the murder of his girlfriend, Elizabeth Bain.
Thank you, Samantha, for briefing our viewers on the events that led up to Robert Baltovich's first trial. Now, before I get into the details about the first trial, I just want to say that as a member of the Innocence Ottawa project at the University of Ottawa, I am very delighted that the Baltovich case is being discussed today on today's episode of Unsolved. I think this case really highlights the flaws in our criminal justice system, as well as the rising issue of wrongful convictions within Canada. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about his first trial. As mentioned by my colleague Samantha, Baltovich was arrested on November 19, 1990 for Elizabeth Bain's murder, and on February 4, 1992 began his first trial before Justice John O'Driscoll, along with more than 100 witnesses ready to take a stand. The Crown dropped the charge to second-degree murder, and Baltovich was painted as, and I quote, a spurned lover who became murderously angry when Bain tried to end their relationship. Baltovich maintained his innocence while his lawyers claimed that someone else may have committed the crime. In fact, and now here's something interesting about the case, and my colleagues will discuss this further on, but a witness provided testimony that they had seen a blonde man near Elizabeth Bain before she disappeared. And as we'll see later on in the podcast, this person is suspected to have been Paul Bernardo, the Scarborough rapist at the time. On March 31st, 1992, a jury found Baltovich guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the eligibility of parole for 17 years. In May 1992, Baltovich hired a new attorney and filed an appeal. The appeal cited a number of suspect issues, including the judge's significant errors that deprived Baltovich of a fair trial. One of the primary issues was the judge's address to the jury, in which the judge continuously emphasized the Crown's theory and ridiculed the defense. Not only that, but the judge failed to warn jurors about the shortcomings of 3 witnesses who had been hypnotized in order to sharpen their memory. 4 years later, in 1996, Robert Baltovich filed an appeal.
This case kept getting set aside for years until the court finally reviewed Baltovich's case in September 2004. That's more than 10 years after the first conviction. On December 2, 2004, the Court of Appeal refused to acquit Baltovich, but set aside the conviction and ordered a completely new trial. Robert Baltovich was released on bail after spending more than 8 years in prison. On April 22, 2008, 4 years after Baltovich was released from prison, he was tried for the second-degree murder of Elizabeth Bain in 1990.
The trial only lasted 30 minutes.
Yes, Crown prosecutors couldn't proceed due to a lack of evidence, and a quote from the trial said, "It has become apparent that there is no longer any reasonable prospect of a conviction at this point." Even though the charges against Baltovich were going to be dropped due to a lack of a case from prosecutors, jury members were given a few minutes to discuss the case and came back with a verdict. After spending 8 years in prison, Robert Baltovich was found not guilty of second-degree murder charges.
It's an unbelievable relief. It's an 18-year nightmare, and in a half an hour it's over. So I'm just glad it's over. No more bail, no more conviction, no more charges. Just I get to live the rest of my life free.
Now, there were many issues with the police investigation as well as the first trial. One issue was the use of hypnosis on eyewitnesses, as discussed previously by Samantha, as well as potential problems with using eyewitnesses to convict an individual as they can be unreliable. Another issue was a tunnel vision that was used by police and the prosecutors during the investigation. They narrowed in on Baltovich very early on, while also ignoring other possible suspects. They also appeared to ignore evidence and eyewitness testimony that did not fit into the narrative that Baltovich was a suspect. Another issue in this case was the lack of full disclosure from the prosecution. It was recently found that at the time of the first investigation, that prosecutors had spoken with forensic investigators about evidence that could possibly have acquitted Baltovich back in 1992.
According to the Baltovich team, information from the meeting with the forensic experts was never disclosed to Baltovich, his trial lawyers, or his appeal lawyers, despite several attempts to garner the information by appeal lawyer James Lockyer. In a responding court filing, the Attorney General's office argues that a diligent review of the police file during the appeal would have produced the investigator's note. Asked for comment today, a police spokesperson denied the allegations of a cover-up.
This key evidence was never disclosed to the defense at the time, and records of this meeting were erased. Let's talk about a conspiracy theory that it was Paul Bernardo that had kidnapped and killed Bain back in 1990. Paul Bernardo, otherwise known as the Scarborough Rapist, had committed as many as 21 sexual assaults in the Scarborough area from 1986 to May 26, 1990. First, I just want to mention how this hits home to me, as my mother was living in Scarborough during this time and was followed home one night in June 1987 by a car that matched Bernardo's. It's obviously possible that this was not Bernardo, but coincidences are a little weird. Anyway, I'm going to go over some of the evidence that points to Bernardo as a possible suspect. The first is that Bernardo attended the same university campus as Bain and was said to have been seen on campus at 5:30 p.m. the day that Bain went missing. An ex-girlfriend of Bernardo had also claimed that she had introduced Bernardo to Liz in 1987. This is something that Bernardo denies or claims that he doesn't remember. The timeline is also interesting to look at. The last known sexual assault occurred on May 26, 1990, which was 3 weeks before Bain disappeared. Police described the attack as brutal and expressed concern that the Scarborough Rapist, who they didn't know was Bernardo at the time, was escalating and that he may kill his next victim. 1 month after Bain's disappearance, Bernardo was brought in for questioning but was released. The timeline fits, but this is again all circumstantial evidence, just like Robert Baltovich's case. There were also eyewitnesses that had reportedly seen Bain with a blonde man, worth mentioning that Bernardo was blonde, at a restaurant that Bernardo frequented weeks before she disappeared. She was also seen arguing with a blonde man in a plaza. Being blonde is obviously not a piece of evidence uniquely connected to Paul Bernardo. There was also eyewitness reports that had seen a man that looked like Bernardo driving Elizabeth Bain's car. They both had very similar looking cars, so it's possible that he was driving her car or he was just seen driving his own car. I mean, this is all really circumstantial evidence, which was similarly to how Robert Baltovich was convicted, and we know that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. Bernardo was also interviewed about the Robert Baltovich case in 2007 and was asked whether he knew her or if he had any involvement in her disappearance.
Did you kill Elizabeth Bain on June the 19th, 1990?
Well, it's a loaded question. I mean, are we going to go back and go through the time sequence of what happened in my life?
Did you have anything to do with her disappearance?
No,
Did you know Elizabeth Bain?
not that I know of.
Had you ever met her?
I'm going to answer that with I don't remember, because if I did or I didn't, I don't remember. But I know an ex-girlfriend tried to say I might have, but I guess I don't remember.
I would just like to let our viewers know that Elizabeth Bain's body was never found. Her killer is still out there and has yet to be convicted.
Now, it's still important to know that Rob was never formally exonerated. The prosecutors entered the second trial bringing forward no evidence. They allowed jury members to deliberate, and Rob was acquitted, thereby found not guilty.
Thank you for watching our 14th episode of Unsolved. Join us next week as we examine the case of Aaron Walsh.